Thank you for coming today. We're going to talk about transaction fee minimums. Hooray. So I don't think I need to get this basic for you guys, but I will. So transaction fee is a fee that gets paid by the users of the network every time they put a transaction onto the blockchain. In most systems, that fee goes straight to the miner. And so generally, and for most of the presentation today, we're going to be talking about fees that get paid to miners. So the miner who finds the block with the transaction in it gets the transaction fee. In some systems, including I think Mimblewimble, or rather Grin, I think the Grin project, at least for a while, I don't know if they changed it, was intending to burn transaction fees instead of give the fees to miners. This is a bad idea, as we'll discuss later. And then in some systems, you have other things like just proof of work on every transaction instead of a fee, or there's some other sort of access control. I think like NEM or some of the proof of stake systems do weird alternatives to transaction fees. So we're not going to focus on those. We're going to focus on bribing miners is basically what we're doing. So there are three. So when I say minimums, what I mean is things that lower bound what a transaction fee might be. There are three major things that can put a lower bound on transaction fees. The first is spam protection. So Bitcoin Cash was like this big, oh, we're never going to have any fees ever network. And they realized that if you don't have any fees ever, people will just put empty transactions on the blockchain to fill up your blocks and give you a headache. So they're like, okay, we're going to put a fee of 1 Satoshi, which means people still could fill the blocks up. But anyway, so even Bitcoin Cash had to have a fee for just spam protection. The next one is throughput protection, which is what we see in Bitcoin. Bitcoin limits the total number of transactions that there can be on any given day. And so the fee is sort of a way to discriminate, choose which transactions make it onto the blockchain. And you keep the total throughput small. And then people just, as it gets more popular, people have to pay more and more to get access to the blockchain. And finally, orphan protection, which is probably the one that you guys are least familiar with, because it was never really a problem in Bitcoin. But it is a problem on most smaller networks, including Sia. The Sia network has this issue. And basically, we have to add fees to transactions to compensate miners for the risks they take when they include the transactions in the block. Okay, so for spam protection, basically the problem with spam is that transactions take resources. It takes compute, bandwidth, and storage space. And it takes it for every single participant of the network for all time. So once you join the network, you're gonna have to validate every single transaction. And as people continue to make transactions, you have to continue to validate them. So spam really sucks. Adding a minimum fee limits the number of frivolous transactions that can occur. It'll gate spammers, but unfortunately, it will also gate network participants. So you have to like cut down on both people at the same time. And in the early days, Bitcoin had minimum transaction fees purely for spam protection, the same way Bitcoin Cash does today. And there was often like a bunch of debating. I think I talked about this on the next slide. There's often a bunch of debating about like what the fee should be. Should we move it up? Should we move it down? And you had this like centralized Bitcoin core group that's setting a fee every release and like moving things around. And so it's really hard to figure out what counts as spam, what counts as a legitimate transaction. And like one of the big debates in the early Bitcoin days was Satoshi Dice. Luke Dashtier is like very much, you know, Satoshi Dice is spam. They're cluttering up the network. This is illegal. And he would like contact legal authorities about spammers and rat on Satoshi Dice. Some people thought that Satoshi Dice is perfectly legitimate and that like they're using the blockchain for blockchainy things, even if they're doing it for penny amounts. Like why is that considered spam? Satoshi Dice was a game where you would send money to an address, and then there'd be some random number, blockchain-based random number, and then if it was the right random number, you got more money back. So it was a gambling site. And people would often gamble with pennies, or like it'd common for like a miner to find a block reward and then just send the whole block reward to Satoshi Dice. Yeah, it's just hard to tell the difference between a legitimate use case and a spammer use case. And often spammers have like more money and more resources and like just a bigger budget than legitimate use cases. So sometimes you can have a fee to block spam and you don't block the spam, and you do block legitimate users, and you're just shooting yourself in the foot. So overall, like, it's centralized and you can't do it very well and whatever. It's not great. So instead, what we tend to prefer is throughput protection. So we just limit how many transactions are allowed to go through the network at once. We create this sort of, let's see, okay, it's on the next slide. We create this sort of promise to the network that's like, we will, you will never need more than X resources to run a fully validating Bitcoin node. And so as long as you have a computer that is X powerful or an internet connection that's Y powerful, you'll be able to stay on our network, and you'll be able to transact and whatever else. And so since we've made that promise, we actually don't care about spam anymore. And if there is spam and it's consuming resources, we're confident that it's going to be below the promised amount. And so it maybe is higher than it could be, but we just like sort of decide collectively to ignore it. So Bitcoin and Ethereum both have this approach. On Bitcoin, it's a fee limit, or sorry, it's a fee that's based on the size of the transaction. And so Bitcoin makes this general assumption that a transaction's like computational resources is equivalent to how many bytes the transaction is. And in Bitcoin, this is approximately true. There are a couple of edge case exceptions, like you can't do more than a certain number of SIG hashes every block. And so if you do too many signature validations in a block, that's an invalid block. Other than that, it's just size-based. In Ethereum, because it's got a scripting system, you can have two transactions that are the same size. If one has loops in it and the other doesn't, the one with loops is going to be way more expensive. So Ethereum can't do the size thing that Bitcoin does. They have to be more sophisticated. They have a gas limit. And basically, gas is an attempt to measure the total number of resources a transaction takes. And so Ethereum at any given time has an amount of gas that can be spent on a block. Miners are able to move it around, but not instantaneously. They're limited, it moves slowly. So we have the same throughput limit. So when you're below throughput, there's no discrimination. The fee can effectively be zero, except for the other minimums that might be in place. When you hit the throughput limit, it is not fee-based, it's miner-based. And so if there are 10,000 transactions and only 2,000 could get into a block, the miners are going to pick which 2,000. And it is entirely up to the discretion of the miners which 2,000 they pick. The miners also have the option to pick 0. However, we have built in a way into the network to bribe the miners with these transaction fees with little wads of cash that say pick me. So generally speaking, miners do pick the transactions with the highest paying fees, with some notable exceptions. For example, exchanges like Coinbase, and I'm pretty sure Coinbase does do this, will make deals with big mining pools. They're like, hey, we're going to pay you in advance, and then for the rest of the year, every single block you're going to allocate me at least 20 kilobytes or whatever. That way, Coinbase gets certainty against volatility. The miner gets paid in advance, and unfortunately, that's like a centralization problem because that deal is only going to be available to big players. So small miners don't have access to that extra money, and small exchanges don't have access to that extra stability. But that's just what we have to live with in a miner bribery ecosystem, which is what Ethereum and Bitcoin and most everything else is. So I think the next one is the more interesting one, which is orphan protection. So blocks take time to travel around the network. The amount of time that it takes to travel around the network is basically your exposure of orphan risk. And so if two blocks get created at the same time, only one's going to win, especially in a Bitcoin system. In Ethereum, they have this uncle thing, and it's not nearly so bad, but it's the same issue. Ethereum has to deal with this orphan cost as well. And the longer that period is, or the longer it takes a block to propagate the network, the more time that there exists for two blocks to appear simultaneously. And as it happens, big blocks take more time to propagate than small blocks. So we can calculate a cost associated with putting a transaction in a block. So as an example, if we have an expected block reward of $100 and the orphan risk is 1%, there's this large transaction we want to add. Adding it will, because it's a bigger block, it's going to take longer to propagate. We've jumped the orphan risk from 1% to 1.1%. We can actually put a dollar cost to the miner. The miner is losing about 10 cents for putting this transaction into the block that they would otherwise get. And so that's where we get one of the it's like a concrete minimum. Like a miner's not gonna take that deal unless the transaction is paying them at least 10 cents. And this can be a problem in smaller networks that have enormous market caps. I think at one point, like on Sia, the orphan risk for a transaction was like $10 or $15. And luckily, mining pools weren't really optimizing around orphans. They were just adding all transactions, so it didn't hurt us the way it could have. But at one point, the optimal thing to do for all the miners on the Sia network was to just stop mining transactions and mine empty blocks, and then that would probably crater the Sia network, and then the orphan risk value would go down, and then we could engage again. But that's like a crappy that's a crappy thing to do. So it's a problem. And Bitcoin largely alleviated this issue using network optimizations and also pre-consensus techniques, which I'll touch on briefly, but it's really a topic for something else. So network optimizations are pretty straightforward. If you can make it so the network code is faster, the validation code is faster, and like blocks can circulate, the globe in a couple of seconds instead of like 40 or 50 seconds, that's going to have a linear relationship on the orphan risk. So if we can double the propagation time on our network, we're going to have the orphan risk and therefore have the minimum fee introduced by the orphan risk. And then we can keep the network moving. This can only go so far. At the end of the day, you have to get this giant block around the globe in, ideally under 3 seconds is the number most miners have thrown out as they can just round the orphan error out. And it takes a lot of work. So what we actually use, at least what Bitcoin uses, and I'm not sure if any other blockchain uses this, but Bitcoin uses pre-consensus. And so the general idea behind pre-consensus is that all the miners agree in advance what block they're mining. So they already know while they're working on the block what block every other miner is working on. Then when the miner finds their block, they can send out a little tiny message that say, hey, it's what you thought I was working on, plus these 2 transactions. That goes around way faster. Everybody's already validated it. Everybody already validated all the transactions. And so you just do a quick sanity check and you can shoot it right onto the next miner. So this speeds things up substantially. I think on the Bitcoin network today, Bitcoin network actually went even one step further than this. They have what's called the fiber network. Previously, the relay network is basically a bunch of dedicated fiber connections that go around the world. And so Bitcoin miners, my understanding is that Bitcoin miners are actually on a dark fiber network that's private to them that is only used, those lanes are only used to send blocks to each other. So there's no congestion or anything. It's super fast. And I think it's order of within 20 or 30 milliseconds of the speed of light. Bitcoin does a bunch of pre-consensus. This really drives down the orphan rates. Generally speaking, miners are incentivized to do pre-consensus because if blocks are propagating faster, that means that your orphan risk is lower, the amount of money you're paying on orphans is lower, and you have more revenue. That's not always true, however. Large miners sometimes, and there are simulations that I wish I had linked to, that demonstrate that a miner with higher propagation times, if a miner is intentionally making slowly propagating blocks, they can sort of split the network, and they can drive everybody else's orphan rates up more than they drive their own orphan rates up. So it's a variant of selfish mining that does damage to the network, but benefits the miner that's doing the damage. So pre-consensus is centralized. It's not like a fantastic solution. Bitcoin is comfortable using it because if pre-consensus fails, you just fall back to the previous techniques, right? Just optimized block propagation. So it's okay to use pre-consensus because it is, at worst, it is the same as it was before. And then when times are good and when everything is good, it's much better. But it means that if you're thinking about designing a secure blockchain, you can't depend on pre-consensus. And so we can't make assumptions when we're designing blockchains that we can use pre-consensus to get block propagation times down to 100 milliseconds. We have to assume that some nasty miner is going to be able to make blocks that take like 5 or 10 seconds to propagate the globe. Okay, so that's everything that I had to say. Are there questions?
I know a little bit about how Ethereum handles orphans with whether they have like the uncles and have some reward if you mine an orphan, I think. But,
yep.
Could you explain that a little bit? Or you know that?
Okay, so I understand it only medium well. So I'm sort of making this up as I go.
Okay.
So you should look at a reference if you want the actual way it's done. But I know that in Ethereum, if 2 blocks come out at the same time, one gets chosen, one will be an uncle. The next block will point to the one that gets chosen, and then it will also point to the uncle and basically include it. That means the uncle gets a block reward. I don't believe that the transactions in the uncle are counted. I'm pretty certain that the transactions in the uncle block are just thrown away.
There could be overlap with its brother.
Exactly. And then the uncle block gets a mining reward that is smaller than if they had won the race. And the person who includes the uncle block also gets some reward. In the early days of the Ethereum network, where the early days means like the first 2.5 years of the Ethereum network, the equation for adding uncles was actually unbalanced, which meant that you could do a variant of selfish mining where you just increase the number of uncles on the network by a lot. And if you did that, the total block reward of Ethereum would, I think you could, in the optimistic case, as much as like triple the inflation rate of Ethereum, which I thought was pretty awesome. The Ethereum devs didn't think was pretty awesome. I believe they hard forked it and fixed it. So I don't think that's the case in the Ethereum network today, but I think that fix landed like late 2017. Let's see. There's the Ethereum scheme is derived from a paper released by a guy named Jonathan. I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name. It's like Simplinsky or something. I'm sorry, Jonathan, if you're watching this. Jonathan, called Ghost. Which I think is a much cleaner and like nicer way of doing it. Ethereum, to make it more practical, they added a bunch of incentive stuff and they limited the number of uncle paper. It goes back to infinity. But that's something that I would look at. The paper is worth reading, and they discuss all the like fee trade-offs and the orphan rates and stuff. And then they went on and they've made 2 papers since then. One's called Spectre. That was, I think, the sequel to Ghost. And then more recently, they released Phantom as the sequel to Spectre. So they've been working on these like DAGgy things. And generally, I would say across the board, DAGs are terrible. But that's not because DAGs are inherently terrible. It's just because they're a lowest common denominator. Like a lot of not very good blockchain designers gravitate towards them. So the stuff that Jonathan's group is doing, the Ghost, Spectre, Phantom stuff, is all super good. Ethereum is based on Ghost. I think that they made some changes that made it worse, but it's not like iota levels of terrible. It's at least remotely sound. And then I've done some work on DAGs as well. I called my work Jute. I never finished it or published it as a paper, but you can find blog posts about it. Cool.
And is there a reason that Sia and Bitcoin haven't adopted some scheme of rewarding people who have mined orphans?
Yeah, so Bitcoin is hyper conservative. I don't think any of the DAGs, even the top tier DAGs, have hit Bitcoin's like bar for security and reliability and fairness. And that bar is enormously high because you're playing with a financial system. The other reason is that it would be a hard fork for Bitcoin, which, as you probably know, is very religiously avoided. We never hard fork Bitcoin, mostly for centralization reasons. And so because we don't hard fork Bitcoin, it's not ever going to happen. Even if the Bitcoin devs concede that some DAG protocol is far superior, they will not go and chase it, because I don't think we're going to see a hard fork in Bitcoin again, ever. Sia, it hasn't hit our bar either. There is a DAG that I think that if we took, Jute is similar, very similar to Ghost. I think if we took it and polished it a little more, it'd be something we'd be willing to implement. And when we release our microchain stuff in the distant future, that'll probably be DAG based. So eventually.
You mentioned earlier that there's a reason why it's a bad idea to not pay miners, to just discard the transaction fees.
Yeah. So I guess I didn't come back to that explicitly, but the reason it's a bad idea is because transaction fees are the bribes for the miners. So if you're just burning transaction fees, miner has no incentive to take a transaction that burned a ton of money over a transaction that didn't burn a ton of money. Or maybe you could make like a weak argument. And actually, I didn't cover this very well. So there is an extra like layer of incentive that the miners have, which is that they don't want to torpedo the system that's making them a crap load of money, right? So they have, like, mining is a cash cow. Miners want to preserve and protect that cash cow. And so mining empty blocks is kind of setting up that network for failure. So oftentimes miners will take a loss on adding transactions into the block so that they can preserve the value of the network as a whole. And that is those are incentives that we see play out in real time. We have seen pools like F2 Pool and a couple other pools, Slush and Elegius and stuff, mining disadvantageously and essentially giving up money and giving up revenue to protect the usability of the Bitcoin network and of other networks. So it's definitely worth bringing that up because it's definitely important. But yeah, going back to burning transaction fees. So the one reason that a miner might care about a large burn over a small burn is that keep the network valuable. The miner is going to preserve their own block reward and to preserve the utility of the network, they're going to want to prioritize the high value transactions as measured by the burn. But there's nothing super inherent about it. And if you're burning all your fees, that's just begging some centralized entity to start making deals with miners and then have a centralized gateway where they're like, if you pay us $1 and give us your transaction, we'll make sure it gets into a block. And it'll get, and because we have these special deals, it'll get into the block over the transactions that burned $5. And of course the miners would like that because it means more money for them. So that's why I think that's a bad system and one that Grin should abandon if they haven't already. They may have, though. I haven't checked on that situation in many months.
Is Grin implementing Mimblewimble, or did Mimblewimble is just a paper, right? It didn't rebrand or anything.
Right. Mimblewimble's a paper. Grin is some group of dudes, apparently unrelated to Voldemort. But I mean, probably not.
Anonymous, right?
Right. Voldemort's anonymous, and then the Grin lead dev, I think, is Igno. And Igno is also anonymous. Are they the same? I think Igno denies it, but like, who knows? But supposedly Grin is independent of the Mimblewimble paper. It's just the biggest, most worked on, and probably going to be first to launch Mimblewimble implementation.
For the Encore rewards, was that introduced strictly as a solution or like a protection against orphan risk, or is there other reasons for introducing it?
No, it's definitely introduced to address orphan risk. So
Their block time is faster.
right, so there's your orphan risk is a function of, one, how long it takes to propagate the network, and two, how long the block time is. And so if we have a block time of 600 seconds and it takes 10 seconds to propagate the network, that's 1/60th. So the cap on your orphan risk is 1/60th. If your block time is 12 seconds and it takes 10 seconds to propagate the network, your orphan risk might go up to like 80%. So Ethereum's block time is absolutely reckless without this orphan thing. I think most Bitcoin core devs would hold that even with this orphan thing, it's reckless, but it would be definitely broken if they didn't. Like 12-second blocks or 17 or 20, whatever it is today, would be definitely broken if they weren't doing this ghost uncle thing. Since they are, it's not as broken, but it's still broken.
So the limiting factor on block times is usually orphan risk?
Yeah, and that's the number one reason why we can't do like 1-second blocks or quarter-second blocks in networks that do usually get trashed pretty badly by the one miner that has more hash rate than any other miner in really low block time chains is able to mine 100% of the blocks, even if they have only like say 30% of the hash rate, because the other miners just don't have enough time to propagate their blocks and work together. So you end up with like a bunch of independent towers, and the tallest one just wins every single time.
What was the scheme where miners are releasing the blocks they're working on before they have the solution?
Yeah, so that's a general class of solution called pre-consensus. There are a bunch of approaches to pre-consensus. Bitcoin originally used one called the relay network, pulled together by Matt Corallo. Then it switched to the fiber network, which was Matt Corallo redoing the relay network, but better. And so that's another pre-consensus thing. I worked sometime on a scheme called weak blocks, which was originally was a pre-consensus scheme that didn't involve any sort of enforcement. The part that I worked on was trying to get it enforced. That eventually turned into DAG stuff. And so now I think DAGs are superior to consensus enforced pre-consensus.
So I was going to ask, could you enforce that by only allowing a miner to mine a block that they've basically committed to in the block before?
That's basically how it worked. And since it involved adding consensus rules, I eventually came to the conclusion that if you're going to go that far, you might as well just go like full DAG. Because it really was like precursors to the DAG days. And then there's another one put out by a group that does not have a whole ton of academic credit called Subchains. So I probably wouldn't read that paper because you probably end up with more wrong conclusions than correct conclusions. But there are interesting things in it. You just have to be good at distilling past all the garbage. So Subchains is another like pre-consensus thing that existed. I'm trying to think if there are others, but I guess there's like Bloom filter stuff, and I don't know. It's a fair body of research.